So now I want to look at worst case and loss-oriented type frames, because this relates really to what we kind of did in class yesterday. So framing is the method by which we give situations meaning, and loss-oriented framing implies that people tend to frame any choice in terms of the possible risk involved. Studies have shown that in new situations, people tend to consider and weigh the possible risks more strongly than the possible benefits. Work in rational choice theory, a theory about how people make choices, illustrates that most people tend to value the consequences of losses more than the consequences of gains, and act in such a way as to minimize losses. Put another way, they fear a bad outcome more than they expect or pursue the good ones when risks are involved. This method of making choices is sometimes referred to as a worst case or loss-oriented framing. In intractable conflicts, the point is not to make people take risks for risk's sake, but that people fear moving from the status quo. This is even if the status quo is unsustainable or painful because they fear the situation will become worse, more than they look forward to it getting better. So when we look at the rational choice theory assumes that people act rationally, meaning they act to maximize their gains and minimize their losses. This is often investigated using game theory. Here, people are given relatively simple dilemmas, and their choice about how to solve them illustrates their choices. The most common example is a prisoner's dilemmas game, when two players, the prisoners, are given the choice of confessing to a crime or not, and the outcome is determined by the choices both people make. Psychologists have shown that if the game is only played once, most players confess, which avoids the maximum loss. Prospect theory. Prospect theory, developed by Tversky and Kahneman, does not use the simple didactic payoff structure that game theory uses. Instead, it argues that people center their expectations around a variable and movable reference point. The reference point is most easily thought of as the status quo, though it is not always so. In most situations, people are more likely to ensure that they preserve their current situation than to risk losses by seeking potential improvements. Indeed, people tend to sacrifice a great deal in order to maintain their current situation. As Levi notes, people tend to be risk-averse in choices among gains, but risk-acceptant when respect to losses. This is often the problem in intractable conflicts. The risks required to resolve the conflict seem much too great compared to the potential losses. This sort of framing is what leads ultimately to hurting stalemates. Loss-oriented framing is ultimately this tendency to minimize losses while missing opportunities to improve one's situation. Given this tendency, how do individuals make choices? People will tend to overvalue low probabilities and undervalue high. Thus, choice according to prospect theory occurs in two phases. In the editing phase, the actor identifies the reference point, the available options, the possible outcomes, and the value and probability of each of these outcomes. In the evaluation phase, the actor combines the values of possible outcomes with their weighted probabilities and then maximizes over the product. Individuals will make choices that minimize losses, and they are likely to take absurd risks to do so. This is the end result of the two-phase choice theory. In intractable conflicts, especially violent conflicts, this two-phase method of choosing leads individuals to be weary of cooperation. The probability of success is perceived as being low, and the potential losses seem quite high. Interveners must move groups beyond a reference point that projects cooperation as a high-risk choice. This can be accomplished through reframing. As discussed above, for the individual choices necessary to resolve the prisoner's dilemma, reference points are not static, and they do not necessarily represent the status quo. The ability of interveners to reframe the issue such that continuing inaction represents a loss from the reference point, is the key determinant of the success of conciliation movements. Reframing strategies revolve around reorienting the parties towards a reference point. For example, one strategy frames losses as foregone gains. That is, the status quo is a perpetual state of loss from a possible higher state. Similarly, the status quo is a deadlocked situation is often the reference point for negotiations. Here, third parties should focus on extended interactions as the foundation of possible losses and gains. In a mutually hurting stalemate, both sides are getting hurt while neither can prevail or win, creating a condition of constant losses. As Dartmouth argues, recognizing the mutually hurting stalemate opens up the possibility for conciliation. Prospect theory suggests not only is worst-case framing inefficient, it also prevents minimal levels of cooperation in environments of little trust and communication. First steps for parties seeking conciliation should obviously revolve around increasing the level of and the number of channels open for communication. In addition, prospect theory suggests that worst-case or loss-oriented framing will remain a part of the conflict landscape. Thus, the trick is to change one point of view about what constitutes a loss.